Hello, everyone. So, for Legends of the Force, we're going to start things off with our discussion of Shadows of the Empire with a more vlog-esque review before we get more into the reads when we got into the novel itself. And the vlog-esque review is not of the book, but rather of the soundtrack album. Because to give a bit of background, which I'm going to get much more in detail and in depth on for the full video on the for the full video on the novel, and I'll probably be covering the comic a bit there as well. Shadows of the Empire was meant to be a transmedia project by Lucasfilm, coming out of what was at the same time going on with the remasters of the original Star Wars trilogy. Well, not just remastered. This is the first big Lucas tampering, meddling, not the meddling with the Star Wars movies. He'd done this before. He'd added the episode numbers to the opening crawl in later releases of A New Hope. But this was the more dramatic moment for the Star Wars series. And running parallel with this, Lucasfilm decided to take what they've had going on for quite some time now with the novels, with the video game line, the Dark Horse comics, and to a degree also the tabletop role-playing game with Shadows of the Empire. Now, we'd had a degree of cross-pollination through the role-playing game in the past. At this point, we'd had source books for the Thrawn trilogy, for Dark Empire, and so forth and so on, stuff handling the Tales of the Jedi era, which is why I haven't really been covering the West End Games role-playing game stuff much outside from that earlier video discussing the Dark Times. But this is different, because again, this is basically every arm of the Lucas Empire coming in at once to cover this big event. And again, next time I will be covering how that came to be in addition to the actual work itself. Instead, we're going to focus here on the thing that I can't show bits of, which is the soundtrack album, because YouTube copyright being how it is, I can't necessarily put audio clips in. I get copyright flags, not anything that would restrict viewership internationally, not like an actual strike in the account, but I get a copyright notice on every video, every single of the Legends of the Force videos that I've put up. And that's even just the chiptune version of the Star Wars theme. So, consequently, I'm not going to go as involved with the production for this video, for the soundtrack album, because Like, I can't get involved with using excerpts of the album. So what I will do, though, is I am going to put in the show notes below links to where you can listen to the album on Spotify, on Apple Music, on Amazon Music, on YouTube Music, and on Tidal. Basically, anywhere I can find it that I can link to it. I'm going to put a link to it down there so that you can listen alongside and look at the track listings and the names of the tracks and that sort of thing as we go along with this. And afterwards. So, my first big impression coming into the soundtrack album with my having listened to it after reread some of the book. I'd read the book a couple times back in the day. Once back in the day and a couple times afterwards. This is kind of like my third or fourth revisit on Shadows of the Empire. And one of the immediate things I noticed was to sat down and just look at the track list in the streaming platform music, which was Tidal, is this is a short album. By way of comparison, all of these Star Wars soundtrack albums, to some degree, are 2-disc albums. The original trilogy on vinyl was a 2-disc vinyl album. The new soundtrack albums that were coming out with the Star Wars movies as part of the remaster and revisit and re-edit and that whole thing. I forget the exact technical term they used for the re-release. But for that release, those albums that were coming with it were also 2-disc albums. A lot of times they included, now to fill things out, they included additional music cues that had been on previous releases, but also alternative cues, and this without getting into such circumstances where Lucas had asked John Williams to go back and do new music for the films, like with Return of the Jedi, where Return of the Jedi had a new closing suite done with Lucas's planned expanded release of the films. Also, like around this time, we have the we have the prequel trilogy now starting to enter pre-production as part of this as well. It's important to mention. So going into this, my first impression I took away from this was, this is a fairly short album. And the book is not, it's not particularly larger than any of the Star Wars novels that we've had to date, that we've covered on the show. But that said, it's still a little bit longer than some of the Star Wars novelizations that we've had. Like the film novelizations that have come out at this point. So this left me wondering, okay, what is this going to sound like and how are they going to incorporate themes for characters and that sort of thing? Which leads to the second point when I was listening to this, which is the album starts out and ends strongly, trying very much to evoke the spirit of John Williams' score while not being written by John Williams. Let me pull this up on my computer real quick. So, we have the Shadow of the Empire soundtrack composed by Joel McNeely. I'll pull him up real quick so we have some information on who he is. So he's an Emmy Award-winning composer. He has worked previously on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles television series and the Radioland Murders, which is one of the films that Lucas did that wasn't Star Wars and wasn't Indiana Jones related, that ultimately ended up kind of tanking somewhat. Everyone remembers Howard the Duck as being Lucas's famous in-between Star Wars flop. But there's also the Radioland Murders. In any case, he has since composed, he's the composer for much of the Orville. He's done a bunch of composition work on like American Dad. He has done a lot of direct to video composition stuff. He did the Virus horror films. He did the music for the not the Marvel's Avengers, but the John Steed and Emmett Peel live action Avengers movies, one with Uma Thurman and Ralph Fiennes. That one. So like it's not like a lot of like really high profile, highly successful composition stuff. But like he'd done blockbuster films. In fact, he probably some of his bigger blockbuster films came after this came out. But before this, he'd done basically like he'd done the English soundtrack for Super Cop, and that's as in the Jackie Chan movie, because Harvey Weinstein, of course, he's going to redo the soundtrack. And he done the sequel to Splash. Also, this music for the Wilford Brimley sitcom dramedy series, Our House. So that's what he'd been done prior to this, and this is not this isn't a bad soundtrack necessarily, but this is certainly, I would argue, compared to his earlier stuff, a little more ambitious in a few respects. Because, again, a lot of his projects before this were film soundtrack stuff. Not necessarily, like this is effectively a symphonic suite for a movie that doesn't exist. And which doesn't have visuals you can work off of to handle pacing the way you would for a movie. So that is significantly challenging. And so this leads to a bit of another problem here, which is while it's not structured musically in the same way of the Star Wars film soundtracks, in terms of you have this piece of music that's meant to fill a scene of this length. You have 5 minutes, say, of the movie of the Millennium Falcon dodging TIE fighter attacks with Luke and Han in the two quad laser cannons fending off the TIEs while Chewie flies the ship and Leia keeps track and provides instructions on how many enemies are left and that sort of thing. Like in the first movie. No, you have to a certain degree, from a time standpoint, you have basically as much time as you kind of have on the record divided by the number of tracks that you're deciding to do, which I get. But the thing is, you are ultimately still doing a Star Wars score, and the soundtrack is, for this, presented as a Star Wars film score. Not as, because we are predating stuff like Rogue One, like Solo, that sort of thing, which are Star Wars, or even for that matter, the television series like The Mandalorian, where you have Star Wars side film projects where they are being made with musical language that evokes the main trilogy, but is not themselves the main trilogy, often in these cases because the main Star Wars cast, if they show up at all, are very much guests in these narratives, are side characters in these narratives. Leia shows up in Rogue One, but Rogue One is not her story. It leads into her story, but it is not. But the film itself is not her story, and the soundtrack reflects this. But it does bring in music from the first Star Wars movie as appropriate to evoke themes like the Death Star theme, like Darth Vader's theme, as those elements and those characters pop up into the story. By contrast, Joel McNeely's soundtrack album for Shadows of the Empire, while it does at the beginning and end bring in John Williams's themes, for example, the book opens with, to reestablish where we're at in the timeline, references to elements from and retellings of scenes from Empire Strikes Back, with the establishment that Prince Shizor is like just out of frame in the scene where Palpatine is talking to Vader on the Executor over hologram. What is thy bidding, thy master? My master. That whole scene. That he's there and is present for that and gets information from that will in turn drive the narrative. So we do get a nice bit of that first track, which uses some cues from that scene and subtly introduces Shizor's theme to put a spin on that moment. That works fine. We get a direct evocation of the music cues from Return of the Jedi for when Leia has a nightmare dream, remembering Han getting frozen carbonite. We have a reference to the cues that were used for the Dark Side cave when Luke is remembering this when he's on Tatooine, doing some basically training on a high wire. That sort of thing. And that's all just the first track. Plus, also, of course, we have the full Star Wars fanfare. The whole, and all the way the whole thing to as far as how the whole opening version is done with the thing to the and pan down to normally a spaceship. Like, all of that is absolutely there. And that is the most John Williams that they get into basically until the end of the album. And I understand that this is not John Williams. This is a different composer. This is Joel McNeely. But on the other hand, you are doing not all John Williams soundtracks sound like Star Wars. At this point, John Williams had set up a musical cinematic language for what Star Wars is supposed to sound like, what Star Wars scoring, the score of a Star Wars story, a core story, not an Ewoks movie, because that's basically all we had in terms of live action side stuff at this point. Speaking of Wilford Brimley, at this point was Ewoks, and I think even then they brought in some of the Ewok cues and Ewok recurring themes from Return of the Jedi for those films. So, by contrast, McNeely doesn't really engage much with character themes. Normally, how I would look at this, if from a composition standpoint, would be if I'm looking at the Shadows of the Empire, okay, if I was going to do a soundtrack album for a novel, for a Star Wars novel involving the core cast, not a side thing like an X-Wing novel or what have you, is I would go, okay, these are our core characters in the story, and so their themes are going to be present. Luke's theme, Leia's theme, if there is a significant theme for Lando from Empire, bring that in, that sort of thing. And incorporate that into certain sequences. For example, I'm partway through the book now, I'm almost halfway done. But apart from my reread, but through the Beggar's Canyon chase, with the bit where Luke threads the eye of the needle on his swoop bike, that is a moment where where musically, the thing the Star Wars thing to do is bring up the main title theme, da 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 da, as Luke pulls off this maneuver, and the other swoop bikers either somebody ends up blowing up their swoop bike against the eye of the needle, or the others go, nope, this ain't worth it, man. We're backing off. If they do that, that's the big triumphant moment of that sequence, and the music which should reflect that by bringing a main character's theme to the forefront. Supporting character, and also Vader, and the Imperial themes. So, like, we in the Imperial March, that should be coming up when we're relating to various elements of the story that are building up to the Death Star plans and the Rebel Alliance. Also, the Emperor's theme. The Emperor pops up at various points, and it's these little game of cat and mouse between Prince Shizor and Darth Vader, and the Emperor just kind of stirring the pot. And we should use work his theme in there a little bit, to kind of keep him as a thematic presence, even if he himself is not physically in the scene. His aims, like Prince Shizor getting the Death Star plans or information on the location of the Death Star to the Rebel Alliance, where he thinks he's setting up the Rebel Alliance for a trap and to pull one over on Vader, but we, as the audience, because this book came out after Return of the Jedi, no, this is Palpatine kind of knew this was going to happen. This was actually part of his plan because he wanted this information to get to the Alliance in the first place, and this is a good deniable way to do that. Like, slip in Palpatine's theme a bit there. And related to this, we also need a couple new, at least 3 new character themes. We need a theme for Prince Shizor, and we get that. You get a full track of Prince Shizor's theme that's focused on there. But sadly, which isn't used as particularly significantly anywhere else in the novel. Like, there's a track that is meant to be kind of a seduction sequence with Shizor using his pheromones to try and seduce Leia, while at the same time other stuff is happening and going on around Coruscant, and with Prince Shizor's home base there, that is its own thing. And Shizor's theme is remarkably not used there. Also, the track is tempoed like a waltz, which is odd. Because when I think musically, and I think of a dance that would be a seduction, I think, a tango. I think, or I would think of tracks from certain operas, rather than how sometimes with John Williams will occasionally make little references to Wagner or to Holst or that sort of thing with this, with the soundtrack to the Star Wars movies. This would be a place to reference something like Carmen, as far the opera Carmen, or other similar works of that variety of works which have a heavy. No, let's not beat around the books here. Beat around the bush here. A heavy kind of sexual element to it, where a character is seducing or being seduced, as being a significant part of the plot. Parts of Don Giovanni would work for this as well. But waltz in this case doesn't quite work for me in this way, for this, for that track, for what they're even you put aside, hey, we're not trying to fill the runtime of a movie. We're still trying to evoke emotionally certain scenes. This doesn't do that as well. And the other bits are, we don't get a theme for Dash Rendar, who, in addition to being the main character of the video game, is clearly meant to be a significant character coming out of this, putting aside how things bear out in the narrative. We don't get a theme for Dash Rendar. We don't have a theme for Black Sun as an organization the way that we have a theme for the Empire. And if nothing else, if if we'd gotten an additional theme for Black Sun, that would have made things interesting in terms of incorporating that into various tracks written for sequences in the novel to play up the machinations of Black Sun as an organization, if not necessarily if you're not using Prince Shizor's theme solely as the theme for Black Sun. It gives it as a kind of lingering in the black background of, even though Prince Shizor really the first half of the book has very little direct interactions with our main cast, and he has more interactions with Vader, and arguably, I'll get into this with the novel, Shizor's read on the power dynamics between Vader and the Emperor is spectacularly wrong in interesting ways, which again, that other video we'll get into. But we don't get any opportunities to have cues or themes getting into that power dynamic. We should have a theme here that is basically, or not even a theme, but a piece of music on this, which is the Vader and Shizor hate each other's guts music. Even if just do the pure take of we're covering moods, we're covering themes, there should be like the dynamic between Vader and Shizor is a mood. The dynamic of Leia wanting to go after Han and making ultimately increasing larger risks and potentially letting down her responsibilities to the Rebel Alliance as part of this chase after Han. That's a mood, and that's a mood that is represented and could be done with existing themes and working in other ones in there. Like taking the love theme from Empire Strikes Back and doing some stuff with that to reinterpret that to fit where Leia's mindset is in, like, or just taking the dynamics of certain things and using them as moments to kind of bounce the pre-existing themes and your new themes you've composed off of each other. But we don't get that. And I'm not saying that McNeely should have just played the hits, but it's one thing when you're doing a story that has musically such a long reputation of character themes and group themes that uses leitmotif possibly more heavily than Wagner ever did. And arguably to such an extent that most people associate leitmotif now less with Wagner and more with Star Wars. That because of that to be doing a new piece of music in this universe with these characters, particularly ones who are so associated with particular themes and pieces of music and that sort of thing, and then just to not take advantage of it, not utilize it, not engage with the language in the way that people would the way that is that you come to it for. Because you buy a Star Wars album, you are coming to it to hear the new themes and to hear the new themes interact with the old themes in new and interesting ways as an extended like jazz riff. Like if you're doing a score as like, how to put this? If you were to do like a jazz reinterpretation of the music of the Ring cycle, where you're taking all these themes and then mashing them into each other in a more improvisational way, and doing like a jazz concept album. Like that's kind of actually honestly what the Shadows of the Empire soundtrack could have been. It could have been the equivalent of a jazz concept album inspired by the Ring cycle, where you're taking the established themes that Wagner put together for these characters and these places and concepts, and then playing off them in interesting ways in that regard. That's kind of what, if you're going to do a soundtrack for a Star Wars novel, that's kind of the assignment. And I don't necessarily know if I get the vibe ultimately coming away from this, if Neely truly understood the assignment completely. It's not a bad album, but it's also not an interesting album. It's kind of there. And like for all the faults of for the faults of Shadows of the Empire as a story, it is still interesting and engaging and keeps me roped in and coming along with it. Shadows of the Empire as an album, as a piece of music, as a collection of music, on the other hand, does not give me the point of, when I'm reading this, going, this piece of music evokes a sense of this sequence from the book. And that is, I think, its greatest failing. So next month, I will be returning to, or at least probably next month, I'll be returning to Legends of the Force, and with my thoughts on Shadows of the Empire as a novel. And we'll probably dip back into this a little bit when I get into the history of Shadows of the Empire as a franchise, as an event, and discuss the comic a bit as well. But that will be next month. Again, there will be links below to where you can find this album on various streaming services and purchase it physically or digitally. The Amazon links will be affiliate links, as they usually are. So, but that will be... Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. And also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Toss me a few bucks also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.